Okay, slide 3. During the 1620s, France as a nation returns to some stability, and with this stability comes a resurgence of interest in literature and theatrical performances. At the same time, a rekindled interest in neoclassical principles of theater begins to affect playwriting. And in 1634, a playwright named Desmarets, Demaret, Desmarets, writes the first French tragedy to observe the neoclassical rules fully. From this time on, French playwrights continue to change and develop French drama. Tragedy becomes a really popular genre, and themes of love versus honor were those that were most explored. Comedy in France is set on a new path. Before, there was like a big emphasis in comedy on comic servants, and now comedy starts to be written about the intrigues and misunderstandings of lovers. So there were still some playwrights who were rebelling against the neoclassical rules and were managing to write plays that were popular. And this actually gets shut down because the French government forms something called a French Academy, which begins casting verdicts on plays that became controversial for not following the neoclassical ideals. Isn't that crazy? They would cast verdict. A play would be written and it would become popular, and someone would be like, wait a minute, this play does not follow the neoclassical rules. Take it to the French Academy. And the French Academy would cast a verdict saying whether or not it followed the rules. And if it didn't, if they found that it didn't follow the rules, the play would basically be like shut down. It seems crazy, but most people behind this movement really wanted to encourage the development of French art so that France might become the cultural leader of Europe. The French Academy was basically like this arbiter of literary taste. It was formed in 1637 and it still operates to this day, probably in a little bit of a different manner. There are 40 members of the French Academy. We might all be thinking of this as like, whoa, that is way too much. That's so much like interference in art. But it did propel the French playwrights to like up their game and really become much more skilled. As they started more and more to adhere to the neoclassical ideals, they wrote more and more skillful tragedies and comedies, and this eventually paves the way for the playwright Moliere and his famous comedies, which combined the comedy of intrigue with farce. We are going to be diving into a famous Moliere play called Tartuffe, which honestly, in my opinion, is still super funny today. So whatever paved the way for Moliere works for me because I think he's awesome. All right, more on him later. I'll see you on the next slide.